Let's talk about the definition of the trig functions. There are 6 trig functions, and those are the sine, the cosine, tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant. And the sine of an angle is a ratio of 2 sides of a triangle. Because when we're talking about trigonometry, we're talking about the study of triangles, the relationship between the angles and the sides. And so specifically, we're talking about a right triangle where you will have a right angle, meaning you have a 90-degree angle in the triangle, and you want to look at one of the angles. So you call that angle theta, and then in relationship to this angle that's here, you're going to name the sides. Now, the one thing that never changes is that the side that is opposite the 90-degree angle is considered the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is the longest side of the triangle and always is across from the 90-degree angle. Now, when you're talking about the other 2 sides, which are the legs of a triangle, the side that is across from the angle that you're studying is considered the opposite side, and the side that is touching the angle that you're studying is called the adjacent side. Now, when we put this, there's different ways to define trigonometry. And so when we put this in to our xy plane, typically what we're looking at is we'll look at an angle. And so the terminal side, let's say we're looking at this angle. Oops, let me read that. So we're looking at this angle here. Now this is the initial side that starts on the positive x-axis. And the side here is where the angle ends, is called the terminal side. And so you can see that with this, what I drew, if you draw a perpendicular line down to the x-axis, you end up with a triangle here. And so that's what we're kind of looking at in trig. And so there's different ways to approach this. And this is the first way, this definition, I'm going to say that sine is the ratio of y over r. And what I mean by y over r is I mean this perpendicular line that I've drawn down is considered the y, because you are looking at the point that is right here. And so in order to get to that point on our coordinate plane called x, y, you have to travel r units. And you have to travel x units to get to that point. So this side is considered x. And then from the center to the point is considered r, or the radius. And we can find that using the distance formula. So r will be found, r is plus or minus the square root of x squared plus y squared. So in this definition of trigonometry, we say that the the sine is the relationship of y divided by r, or if I'm color coding this, my r is the green side, my y is the blue side. And then cosine would be x over r. And tangent would be y over x. The three other trig functions are the reverse or inverse of these. So cotangent is the inverse of tangent. So it would be taking x and dividing by y. Secant is the inverse of cosine. And so that relationship would now be r over x. And cosecant is the inverse of sine. So that relationship would be the r over y. And so that is one way to approach the trig functions. So, for example, let's do an example with this. If you are told that the sine of the angle is 3 over 5, and that the angle is in quadrant 1. So that means that your angle in our xy plane, there are 4 quadrants. They are labeled like this with Roman numerals, starting here in this upper right quadrant and going counterclockwise around. We've got quadrant 1, 2, 3, 4. And so this means that your angle has the initial side here, and it falls somewhere like this in quadrant 1. And so we want to find the, let's say it says find the cosine of this angle. Well, we can find the cosine. And how we would do that is we would say that this is my y over r, and I know that cosine is the ratio of x over r. So in my triangle here, my y would be 3, my r would be 5, and I have to find this missing side because I need the x over r. So in order to find that, I can do it like this. I can say r is equal to plus or minus the square root of x squared plus y squared. We can also write this formula as r squared is equal to x squared plus y squared if I squared both sides. And so I am looking, in order to solve this, I need to find x. So I'll plug in what I know. I know that r is 5 and y is 3. So that means 25 is equal to x squared plus 9. Subtract 9 from both sides, we get 16 is equal to x squared. And then take the square root of both sides to end up with x is either plus or minus 4. Now, because the angle falls in quadrant 1, you can only have a positive x value. And we'll talk more about the trig functions and what quadrants they fall into and their positive and negative as we move on. But that would mean that my x value could only be positive 4 because it's in quadrant 1, and so this would be the cosine of theta, 4 over 5. So that is an example using that definition of a trig function. Another definition of a trig function that you may have seen before looks like this, where the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse, where the cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse, where the tangent is the opposite over adjacent. And then we have the inverses. So cotangent would be the inverse of this, adjacent over opposite. And then we have cosine, which would be that inverse is secant. So that would be hypotenuse over adjacent. And we have the cosecant, which would be hypotenuse over opposite. And so this relates to when I drew out the triangle earlier, the right triangle, this is the hypotenuse side. And if I'm looking at, depending on which angle I'm looking at, if I'm looking at this angle, then my sides are going to be different. So let's say I'm looking at this angle, then I'm going to call the side opposite that this one. And the side that touches the angle, the adjacent side. And so if I have an example that would use this definition, could look like this. So let's say we have this problem, and we have a triangle, and it says that the sine of theta is 3 over 5, so same as the previous problem, and that theta, that we want to find the cosine of theta, and it will usually tell you where the angle is. And so if you want to find the cosine of theta, here you have a right triangle, so you can use the Pythagorean theorem to find that missing side. And we know the Pythagorean theorem says you can take the one leg, square it, add the second leg, square it, and it's equal to the hypotenuse squared. This is the same formula as x squared plus y squared equals r squared, just using different words. So I would say 3 squared plus my unknown squared is equal to the hypotenuse squared, or I've got 9 plus x squared is equal to 25. And then subtract 9 from both sides, I get this. Take the square root of both sides, and I get plus or minus 4. Now, the plus or minus sign like I said, we'll look at in terms of the quadrant that you fall into. So, but we will take this as the cosine is equal to the adjacent over hypotenuse. The adjacent side we found to be 4, and the hypotenuse is 5. So I keep talking about the positive and negative values. So when we refer to positive and negative values in the quadrants, this is a one way to memorize this, and it's mentioned in the book too. But we have quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as we go around counterclockwise, all of the 6 trig functions are positive here. So all positive. And then in quadrant 2, we've got sine and its inverse. So I'm going to say sine and also cosecant are positive here. And then in this one, we have tangent and its inverse, which is cotangent, are positive here. And in the last one, we have cosine and its inverse, which are positive here. And a way to remember that is the phrase, all students take calculus. And so I wrote it over here, all students take calculus. And we'll talk more about this in the next video.